And there was one night I was there and I kind of woke up in the middle of the night and I was like, it sounds like someone's at the door. But one of my roommates like worked in Atlanta sometimes volunteering. And so he'd get home really, really late. And so I was like, oh, that's probably just him coming in really late, and I didn't think anything of it and I went to sleep. And then I got up early that morning at like 6 a.m. to go jogging. And when I opened the door, my dad was like falling into my apartment. He was like leaning against the door.
I'm Jamie Beebe.
And I'm Jake Deptula. On today's episode of Strictly Stalking, we're chatting with Victoria Bethel.
Victoria spent most of her childhood and young adult life being stalked by her own father.
Victoria, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. My name is Victoria Bethel, which I guess you already said. I'm 25. I am a nurse. I'm just starting a new job actually on Monday working in the ICU, which I'm really excited about. I'm a former musician, one of 4 siblings, and I guess since I was about 5 years old, my dad has, in fact, been stalking me. My dad was actually a preacher. He was a Southern Baptist preacher, which I think provides a little bit of context. And I'm the youngest of 4, and before the second kid, my brother, was born, my dad went on a fast to be like Jesus, and after that, I think he lost a lot of weight in a very short amount of time, according to my mom. And he'd already had some issues with, I guess, just psychiatric issues in general. And so after that fast, it really kind of sent him off the deep end, if you will. And he and my mom went into counseling. And my sister and I were actually both born over the course of the 8 years they were in counseling. And it got to the point where she ended up getting a divorce, and she moved us to Georgia. And so for about a year and a half, my dad was actually institutionalized in a mental hospital for manic depression for part of that time in Arkansas. And we had moved to Georgia, and he followed us after about a year and a half. And we knew he was following us because we saw his red truck behind our car while my mom was driving us to school, because she was a teacher and we were all in elementary school. And she said, I think that's your dad. And after that, we started seeing him in the woods behind the house we lived in, or thinking we'd spot him, on the road. And sure enough, we ended up in the court system not long after that, going through the process of him being granted visitation again.
When did your mom feel that it was time to leave and escape your dad?
I think his behavior started taking a toll on us kids. And I don't remember a lot of it because I was the youngest, but I know for a fact, based on what my oldest sister especially and my brother have told me, that he had become very, very controlling. He was very religiously manipulative. Like, he would have them sit me and my sister, who's 2 years older than me, down and read us Bible stories, and kind of use a bunch of biblical stories or verses that were very specific to excuse his behavior. So I guess my mom and my sister both remember him spanking her because she wasn't eating fried chicken the right way, or spanking her because she wouldn't turn the pepper grinder in the right direction or something. And they both remember that. And she was going gray at the age of 10. My mom was noticing her just have gray hair. And so she had a friend that was kind of involved in the legal system. I think she was a private investigator. And she told her, Janet, if you don't get out of this and take the kids, he could take your kids. And just that fear in combination with the toll it was taking on us made her decide it was time to go ahead and leave, because she was very religious. It was against her religion. So it was a really tough decision for her, and a really strong one. I'm very grateful to her for making that decision, because things could have gone a lot differently.
When did you realize that something was wrong? Was it something your mom was talking to you about, or was it more something you just felt?
it was just not feeling safe when I was with him. When he did get granted visitation, he had really erratic behavior, and he'd like pull over on the side of I-85, which is a huge highway through Georgia and through a lot of the Southeast, actually, to help people, because that's what, Jesus wanted him to do. That's always been the theme. And I think him just acting in ways, that my mom would never act, that didn't feel safe. And then we would tell her about them, and she would kind of be like, that's not okay. That's not safe. I need you to call me if that's happening, because I want to protect you. She got a cell phone for us, actually, when they were kind of new, just in case we were in a situation where we didn't feel safe. Would keep showing up in our neighborhood when we weren't on visitation with him. Like, his car would be parked on the street in the neighborhood, one street over from where our house was. And people would call the police on him or be like, what is this car doing parked, in the street with a guy sleeping in it in our neighborhood? He would come by our schools a lot for whatever he could, to just drop things off to us, like change. He also, when we would go on visitation with him, I think I mentioned him just like pulling off to the side of the road in the car to help whoever needed help. It didn't matter who it was. It could be all four of us kids in the car. It could be like two of us girls. When we went on visitation, his behavior was very controlling. I think there was one night where we didn't have toothpaste, and he woke us all up at like midnight because we all needed to get in the car with him to go get toothpaste so we could brush our teeth in the morning. It was just very manipulative behavior a lot of the time. He would get us for 3 weeks in the summer, like full weeks, and he'd normally take us to Arkansas to go visit his family. But the car trip that should have taken 9 or 10 hours ended up taking like 14 to 24, because he'd tell us, yeah, everything's packed, everything's ready to go, or it won't be much longer. And then it would take us 4 hours after he picked us up at 8 a.m. to pack. And he'd get tired on the road and pull off at a gas station to sleep for a while. It was just a lot of unstable behavior, I think, is the best way to put it. And I think we tried to tell the court, like we tried to tell the judge when we'd have to go for the visitation and custody battles, I guess. And I don't know, it felt like they weren't listening to us when we were kids, or I don't know if he just had better legal representation for a lot of the time, because my mom was a single mom and his family was helping him. But it was just crazy, legitimately crazy behavior.
When did the stalking escalate?
I think it really escalated when I went to college. In high school, it was bad. My mom actually ended up getting a temporary protective order for herself in Gwinnett County in Georgia, which is where I went to high school, because he was starting to come to the door. And my mom's remarried. I have a stepdad and a stepsister, and he's my dad. When we get married, I have two older sisters. They will walk down the aisle by him. If I ever get married, he'll walk me down the aisle. He's been a great parent. But my dad would show up at my mom's door and knock and tell her that they needed to heal their marriage, and she was living in adultery, and just going on and on with that kind of stuff. And then at the same time, he was still coming to my school every day. When I was in high school, they would come to your classroom with a blue slip, and that would mean you had to go to the office. And I was a big nerd and a really good kid in high school, but it was getting to the point where I get a blue slip every day because my dad had dropped off, again, spare change, or sometimes like a $20 bill, or like an old Subway sandwich, or a whole pizza, or just whatever he thought he needed to provide for us. At that point, he wasn't working anymore because he felt that God wanted him to be where his children were more than he wanted him to be employed and honestly have a home. I think at this point is when he became homeless as well, which is hard as a kid because you don't have any control over that, but you wish you did, or you wish you could do something. But at that time when I was in high school was when he just kind of stopped living any semblance of a normal life. And then when I went to college, I guess I did the normal college thing where it's rebel against your parents and try to think for yourself. And that's an important part of growing up. But for me, I know I tried to have a relationship with him. And my mom would always say things when I was growing up, like, you got to be careful. If you give him an inch, he'll take a mile. And that really came to be true, because I'd be like, we'll have lunch once a week. And that turned into him living outside of my dorm. It's a girls' dorm, and there's a man sleeping out on the bench in front of it and waiting for me to come out and watching my window. And it got to the point where he got banned from the University of Georgia campus altogether for loitering. And that continued when I moved off campus. He got arrested, and I think that was kind of the beginning of his relationship with because there's a UGA police, and Athens, Clark County, which is where UGA is, there is their own city county police. And when I moved off campus is when the city and county police became acquainted with my dad.
How did the people around you react? Your friends, your teachers, all those people?
It kind of showed me who my real friends were. I had some roommates that were understandably uncomfortable with my father living outside of my dorm. When I was a freshman, my roommate actually moved out after the first semester, and we were still friends. We still get along just fine, but she said she couldn't handle that, and I totally respected that. But at the same time, it's embarrassing when you're 18 years old, like you're saying, and you're starting to try to go and be out by yourself. And I think me trying to have a relationship with him at that time specifically was a huge negative, because it was like he was trying to claim back the childhood he felt like he'd missed out on, even though he was there the whole time watching. So it affected me in the future with roommates when I lived off campus, just being really uncomfortable with it. The police got called a lot. I got woken up by police knocking on the door many mornings, being like, hey, this guy out here is loitering, and he says he's your father. Is he your father? He said y'all were supposed to meet. And I think initially, I'd be like, yeah, this is my dad. Yeah, that's my dad. We weren't supposed to meet. And it just got to where I was so familiar with the cops. They'd ask me, did you tell him he could be here? And I'd be like, no, he's not supposed to be here right now. I actually was a student in the School of Music when I did my undergrad at the University of Georgia, and he spent about 2 months living outside of the School of Music. And I had a new trumpet professor my second year, and I was really excited about it. And I remember having to have the conversation where he was like, I spoke with the dean of the School of Music, and I found out the homeless man that's been standing outside of the school is your dad. And it was embarrassing at the time to be confronted with someone that you're trying to have that professional relationship with, like of a professor to a student. And you're trying to impress because he was a really good trumpet player, and I wanted to be a really good trumpet player. And to have to admit, yeah, that guy out there is my dad that's been living outside of where there's a bunch of college students trying to go to school. And he ended up being a great resource. Both of my professors that were part of the trumpet studio were really supportive, and their wives were really supportive, and they were always invested in what was going on. So that ended up being a positive. But at the same time, like we said, it's college. You're trying to go out and learn how to be an individual. When you have your father, especially one that's hyper religious, watching you 24/7 and assessing your comings and goings and sending you long texts with Bible verses in them, asking you about your comings and goings, it's like a blanket over your life. It was really challenging.
What were their suggestions on how to handle it?
I think something that was important for me to hear, I don't think anybody in my family, except for maybe my mom, is very religious anymore because of my dad and how much he shoved it down our throats. But my trumpet professor, when I was talking to him about how it was kind of confusing because you're raised in a certain way to think some things are right and wrong. And, if you're raised in a church, you're hearing all these Bible stories of God told so-and-so to do this and blah, blah, blah. And my dad would talk like he was that kind of hero. And I guess somewhere in your brain, your dad is your hero to a certain degree. There's like some switch you can't turn off, and him telling you, no, God told me I needed to be out here taking care of you. I love you so much. I'm here for you. I'm here to protect you. And I ended up, I think I was in like tears confiding this all to my trumpet professor. And he was just like, I just want to be straight with you, regardless of what you believe. And I'm not forcing my beliefs on you, but I just think it's really hard to believe God would tell anybody to do that. And that was kind of a way to break for me a little bit from the confusion of like, oh, my dad really thinks this is the right thing. He thinks he's doing the right thing. And it gave me a little bit of perspective to just think, I mean, he's a smart man. Yes, he's mentally ill in one way or another, but he knows somewhere deep down that this is not okay. And it's okay for me to let him know that it's not okay.
Sure. Has he ever been diagnosed with a mental illness?
So I think I saw it typed out one from paperwork in Arkansas that he was diagnosed with manic depression. But when he and my legal battle kind of started in Athens, Clark County, at one point I was able to demand that he get a psychiatric evaluation. And I've never seen the paperwork from here, or from the officials, but it apparently cleared him. So, manic depression in Arkansas to someone that's been homeless for 10 years, who thinks God wants them to stalk their children and loiter at their children's apartment complex, now he's cleared.
How do you bring this up when you're meeting someone new or you're, applying for a job or getting an apartment? How does this factor into that?
Kind of don't bring it up. I think it just kind of comes up when it comes up. I worked in a daycare part-time when I was in college, and he would show up outside of the daycare, or he started doing that. And the parents were asking about it, and I had to ask him to not come by, but he understood that, and he actually stopped coming by the daycare. I know with my older sister, he would watch her car from different exits off 85 when she used to work in Atlanta, and found where she worked and did the same thing he used to do when we were in school. He'd like go to her big office building and drop off food and change at the receptionist for her. I definitely don't let anybody in his family know where I'm living. I think they're kind of coming to terms with where he's at more than they used to be. But for the longest time, I didn't give his mom my address. I still won't give her my address. I give her my parents' address.
What's your relationship like with your extended family on his side?
I think it's a little broken for sure. I wasn't raised around them as much as my siblings were. And especially when I was younger, I was really angry at them because I felt like, I did have my grandmother at one point when I was 8 years old tell me, if you just spent time with your dad, he wouldn't act like this. He'd be perfectly fine if you spent more time with him. And it's been infuriating because it feels like we were getting blamed when we were kids for someone that wasn't well, because they would rather worry about their own lives than try to take care of their brother or their son. So I was really angry about that for a long time. And I am trying to move past that. And I don't know if this is self-imposed, but I still feel judgment for like making the decisions that I've made to protect myself legally, especially when it led to him being punished for violating, my protective orders.
When you were in college, how supportive were the police, the local police, the campus police? Tell us about that.
Mm-hmm. Well, it took me a long time to feel comfortable ever reaching out to them by myself, because I think it felt kind of like a betrayal because my dad had been in jail, and it just, I don't know, it feels wrong, and it's very emotional to see your father, like in the orange jumpsuit or handcuffed or in the back of a police car, even if, that's technically where he belongs based on his actions and based on what the laws are. So it's been tough because, there have been times where I've seen him get arrested for charges that are like urban camping. And that's basically a law against homelessness. And then you kind of feel upset, and indignant because you're like, how can someone get punished for being homeless? But then there's other times, where you see him in orange because he's been stalking you and won't stop watching you, and you've done it. And that brings on a whole new set of complicated and confusing emotions, because at the end of the day, he is my dad. And even if I need to protect myself, it's very tough to reach out and like call the cops on your dad, especially when he does have moments of like being a really normal, charming, smart person. And he is really manipulative in making you think, that he's like following a logical train of thought. So then it makes you kind of second guess yourself, especially, when I was younger and hadn't kind of been able to process all of it and have the space I needed to process all of it. So I didn't reach out to the cops at first, and I kind of knew when things started to change. I think like my sophomore year of college, I was living in an apartment with some roommates. And there was one night I was there, and I kind of woke up in the middle of the night, and I was like, it sounds like someone's at the door. But one of my roommates like worked in Atlanta sometimes volunteering. And so he'd get home really, really late. And so I was like, oh, that's probably just him coming in really late, and I didn't think anything of it, and I went to sleep. And then I got up early that morning at like 6 a.m. to go jogging. And when I opened the door, my dad was like falling into my apartment. He was like leaning against the door. And it was terrifying because I had thought I was being, paranoid the night before, and I had to calm myself down and be like, you're being ridiculous.
When did you start contacting police to get your own restraining orders? How did that all happen? And was it difficult to get these restraining orders?
Getting the restraining order was pretty doggone easy. I had enough of a case history and rapport with the police officers by the time I decided to get one, that it was a breeze, honestly. And I don't even think my dad showed up to the hearing. I don't think he showed up. I think he might have showed up. There's like an initial hearing that you go to, and you file for like an ex parte TPO, or which is a temporary protective order or something. And then you have to go to a hearing a week later. And so I think he showed up to that first hearing, but I got represented by a charity group in Athens that was through UGA, through the School of Law. But I decided to get it because there had been a week where every morning the cops were waking me up, knocking at the door and being like, your dad is out here again. And they pushed me to get one. At the time, I was kind of angry about it. It was like, he's never been violent. This is my decision. But in retrospect, I'm really glad they were kind of like, hey, we're spending our time and resources. Maybe you should think about getting one. And it wasn't an attitude where they were like, we're tired of coming out here. It was an attitude of like, we're worried about you. And I think even though at the time it was really hard, I think like I was betraying my dad. I think it was something I really needed to feel safe. And I've been so much happier since I have had that protection, because there's no way to tell my dad, we can have a relationship on these terms. It's always on his terms. And it always has been. And I think that's what my mom said, by giving him an inch, he'll take a mile. Getting that TPO was like a way of being like, no, this cannot happen on your terms. These are my terms. And it was just hard for me to do because it was so inclusive, no communication. But like I said, I've been much happier. I think it was the right call. And I'm glad those cops encouraged me to go ahead and show up and get it done.
How is life different now after these orders? I mean, he basically abides by them?
No, he didn't abide by the first one. He violated it twice. And I think I actually, which is not what you're supposed to do, and it could have completely invalidated my TPO for anybody who is needing to get one. But I reached out to him, I think, once and said, I know you're by my house. That's in violation of the TPO. You need to leave. And he didn't leave. He was living in the woods by the apartment I was living in at that time. And he continued to be there. And so I called the cops on him. And they came, and one stayed with him and interviewed him, and one stayed with me and interviewed me. And then it happened again. I actually moved after that had happened, and he found me. I didn't move very far, but he found me again, and he was kind of hiding between some trees. And I saw him, and I called the cops again, and I didn't give him any warning that time. And after that, they went ahead and pressed the charges for aggravated stalking. He made an Alford plea, which is neither guilty or not guilty. It's kind of just accepting the charges and accepting the fact that I think they would have enough evidence to prove your guilt without admitting your guilt. So because he made that plea for both of the violations, he got 10 years of federal probation with time served. So he didn't spend any more. I think he had spent at least 30 days in jail, though, because they arrested him after they found him, and nobody would post his bond or pay his bond.
What is your relationship like now with your father after the restraining orders and the court case? Do you have any relationship?
I don't talk to him. I haven't talked to him in like a couple of years, like, to be honest. And I mean, I don't think anybody's going to get me in trouble for saying this, but like sometimes I'll tell my brother, I'll be like, oh, tell him happy birthday from me, or like tell him I'm thinking about him, or, just because I don't hate the man. I really don't.
When was the last time your father tried to contact you?
He tried to get in touch with me. It was like more than a year ago, maybe, more than a year ago. November 2018, around then, but I was house sitting for my brother. And it was kind of a creepy time that it happened, and I have no evidence to support this. It's like one of those things where I'm like, I have dreams, and it's just like that interesting thing. But my cat had like gotten out recently, and I know that I had closed the door, and it was only me and my boyfriend there. And I know he was like, I know I closed the door, and like we'd seen all the cats. And it was really strange. And then the next couple nights we were dog sitting for my brother, and he lived right around the corner from where I was living at that time. And we were staying in his house, and like we kept hearing all this weird crap at night. And I don't know if we were like being paranoid, but it was both of us. It wasn't just me. We were both like, it sounds like someone's walking up the stairs, or it sounds like someone's in the backyard. And we kept investigating. But not every time we heard something. And the next morning I got these long texts from my dad about how wrong premarital sex is, but about how like God can forgive you for that, and about how it's his job as my father to make sure I know what the right way is. And I don't know, I'm not saying he was in the house or he broke into my house or anything like that, but it was just, I know he was around because my boyfriend saw him while I was in class one day. And just all the kind of weird crap that was happening and the weird stuff we were hearing. And then to get those texts from him about, what seemed like the fact that my boyfriend and I were very clearly staying together, in my brother's house and in my house. It was very strange. It was all coincidental, but it was enough to put me ill at ease. And that's the last time I think he's directly communicated with me with those texts, except for when I've seen him in court.
Have you ever been scared of your father? Do you think that he could get violent?
That's like such a tough question because I think that's what scares a lot of the people that care about me is there's a lot of red flags, of him being mentally unwell and him disregarding the law and him disregarding the court system or the legal system at all. And him thinking that God is vindicating everything that he's doing. There's a lot of bad signs that this dude would do a lot of things and think it was fine or not consider the repercussions. And I know that's why my boyfriend gets nervous or my aunt gets nervous or I've had nightmares. I used to have nightmares before we would go see him, or it sounds stupid, but I'd have nightmares if he was around, even before we'd know he was around. If he'd been spotted in the neighborhood that night before I'd even known it, I would have nightmares that same night that he'd been lurking about him kidnapping us or snapping. I guess that's always what you say, what if he just snapped?
Do you ever feel that he could ever be a part of your life again?
I would love to say yes. I would love for something to work out, but I think this separation that we've had over the past couple of years has kind of allowed me to accept, I don't know if he can get better. I don't know if he can just go to a psychiatrist and take medicine and be completely normal. I think he's lived too long in this state for maybe really true improvement to be had. And if that's not going to happen, it's really unhealthy for me to have him in my life. And even if he did get help and we tried to work things out and I was in a better place in my life where I could cope with it, I'd like to think we could try to form a relationship. But then I think about if I have kids in the next 5 or 6 years, do I really want him around my kids? Do I want him having the kind of impact? Because I don't want them to grow up with the guilt that he imposed on me and my siblings for not being a certain way if I ever have children.
What if he tries to reach out to you again? How do you think you'll react?
If he shows up where I'm living, I'm going to call the police because my restraining order that I have, my protective order, which is now the order about his probation. So it's terms of his probation now, not just my order. I would call the police because he'd be in violation of that. And it means nothing if I don't enforce it when he violates it.
Where do you think the best place for your father would be now, just based on everything you know, his condition, everything else?
I have no idea. I used to have a perfect answer. I really wanted him to be institutionalized. But I think now that I'm a nurse and I've seen the other side of things, I don't know if that's the right spot. I don't know if prison is the right place for him, but it sure would get him off the streets when it's cold. And if you break it down, he is a felon. He's been convicted of felonies for aggravated stalking. I don't think he'd tick anybody off or get harmed in prison. He always seems to, his brother, my uncle, who's been one of the only contacts we've had about my dad to that side of the family, because they don't want to hear it, but he's always been a little more real and supportive toward us, especially toward my brother. But I called him before pressing charges when my dad violated my protective order. And he said, honestly, he feels, like he's kind of a martyr when he's in jail or when he's in prison. He sounds like he's motivated and a little happier than he normally is. So maybe it's not a bad place for him to be. I don't like him being on the street, for one, because I don't know if or when he's going to pop up or find me again. But also, it's just not safe. I think he's been hit by a car. He doesn't see well, and he wanders around. He walks everywhere. He doesn't have a car or a home or anything anymore. And you can try to help him. My brother's tried. His brother that I was just talking about has tried, but he doesn't want anything.
What changes have you had to make in your life due to being stalked by your father?
I think like the big one is like not saying where I live anywhere on social media. I guess it's not a big one. It's social media. And I probably shouldn't be sharing where I live anyway, but it's like I'm not saying the city I'm living in or where I'm working or anything like that. Or tagging the restaurants I'm eating at, even, on a regular basis. So just because I know in the past his mom, who is my friend on social media, would tell him, or he'd have friends that like he knew that kind of knew us when we were kids at us and like report back to him about the things we were doing or the places we were at. So just kind of having to be aware that that's a possibility and something you don't want online. He'll find it somehow, one way or another, with help or by himself.
What's some advice you would have for other people in your situation being stalked by a family member?
I think the biggest thing is like go to therapy. Therapy has been really helpful because it's very tough to go through those emotions by yourself. And like, especially if you consider if one of your family members is stalking you, that's going to be some unhealthy behavior you've been subjected to that's affected your ability to cope. Certainly, because it's something you've been exposed to your whole life because it's a family member. And I think it's just understanding that like, there have to be boundaries. And even if it's a family member and family is really important to you, any relationship, if it's a blood relationship or not, has to have respect, mutual respect. And if someone is stalking you and violating your privacy, they're not holding up their end, and you don't have to feel guilty about protecting yourself. Especially if it's a parent, you're not responsible for your parent. There's just this strange biological, emotional boundary where like you can't take care of your parent, until, if they're sick when they're older, that's a different thing entirely. But like when you're in your 20s and your teens, you can't help that your parent is homeless. You can't help that they're sick. You don't have that power and you don't have the money in your life at that point in time to do anything, and I've had to come to terms with that to like let go of all of my feeling guilty about having to take legal action against my dad.
So thankful that you're sharing your story with us.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me talk about my life.
Thank you so much. If anyone out there is in need of help or is a victim of stalking, please reach out. You can find a list of resources on our Instagram at Strictly Stalking.
I'm Jake Deptula.
And I'm Jamie Beebe. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Strictly Stalking.